On behalf of St James Ethics Centre, AMP, the City of Sydney and the ABC, I'd like to welcome you all tonight for this very controversial topic. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre and I welcome you all here tonight. The topic tonight is that there's nothing wrong with designer babies, and it's now my pleasure to introduce the speakers. So leading off as the first speaker for the affirmative is Associate Professor Mark Bowman, who's the Medical Director of Genea. Now, formerly that's an organisation that was known as Sydney IVF. He's joined in the middle there by Professor Julian Savulescu, Director of the UHERO Centre for Practical Ethics at Oxford University in the UK. And last but not least is Parnell Palmer McGuinness, Principal of Thoughtbroker, a communications agency which specialises in making complex and abstract ideas engaging. Welcome the speakers for the affirmative. Tonight, returning to the stage, I think for a second appearance in an Intelligence Squared debate, we're joined by the first speaker for the negative, Professor David Weisbrot. He's Professor of Legal Policy at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. He's joined by Professor Leslie Chenoweth, Professor of Social Work and Head of Logan Campus at Griffith University in Queensland. And finally, the third speaker for the negative is Dr Rob Sparrow, Associate Professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow at the School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies at Monash University, where he researches ethical issues raised by new technologies. Please join with me in welcoming the speakers for the negative. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before this House is that there is nothing wrong with designer babies. I now invite Dr Mark Bowen to present the first case for the affirmative. Dr Bowen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the organisers tell me that this hall holds 800 people. If we're at capacity tonight, that means that 32 of you are carriers of the genetic condition cystic fibrosis, or CF. CF, a condition where faulty genes cause an excess of sticky mucus in a number of organs, including lungs and bowel. 1 in 25 Caucasians quietly carry a CF gene, and if two people who are quiet carriers unwittingly meet and marry, when it comes time to have a baby, you'll be blissfully unaware that your unborn child has a 1 in 4 chance of carrying a deadly disease. However, you'll find out soon enough. Within a few hours of your baby's birth, it will begin to suffocate in its own mucus. If your child survives that process and avoids some of the serious respiratory or, in fact, bowel conditions that can occur within a few hours of birth, you'll go home to a life of around-the-clock physiotherapy for your baby, a constant risk of deadly secondary infection, a shortened lifespan and the probable need for lung transplantation at that stage. And after 2 years of constant care and little sleep, you will look at each other and say, you know what, we love our child, but we are never going to let this happen again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the IVF-related technology of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis has helped thousands of couples in Australia and worldwide. Rather than couples playing Russian roulette with spontaneous pregnancies, waiting to see if their unborn baby carries the problem, and rather than facing the awful decision of whether or not to terminate a pregnancy when the unborn fetus is found to have the problem, couples can use IVF technology to prevent an affected pregnancy in the first place. We can tell for CF carriers which embryos do or don't already have the deadly CF genes and choose to transfer back to the woman only those embryos known not to be affected by cystic fibrosis. The technique is highly successful, safe, and has helped many families carrying tragic genetic disease to prevent passing on tendencies to their children. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust that very few, if any of you, would object to the use of this technology to help couples caught in a deadly genetic web in this way. Try to place yourself in the shoes of those people who face these problems and have to make difficult choices, because remember, many of you, even if you don't know it yet, are already in those shoes. Thank you.
David Weisbrot.
Thank you, Simon, and for your generous introduction. I'd like to join Simon in acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the traditional owners of this area, the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation, and I also pay my respects to their elders past and present. Of Of course, if some of our administrators historically had had their way, those very genetic and social traits that make Indigenous people unique and propelled and sustained the oldest continuing civilization on Earth would have been, to use the administrator's term, bred out for the very grave crime of looking different. Maybe there are some lessons there. Now, some of those leaders no doubt thought that they were acting in the best interests of society according to the standards of that time. And I'm sure that our opponents in this debate have their hearts in absolutely the right place as well. But as C.S. Lewis once put it, of all the tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. Let me leave you with one last true story. A few years ago, an acquaintance of mine named Jim had his whole genome sequenced. And Jim had this done. He was curious. He works in the field. And they found about 100 mutations in genes, in his genes, that should be lethal. But he's now 84 years old, and that Jim is James Watson, the person who won the Nobel Prize for describing the description of DNA. Now, clearly, he survived. Those 100 mutations were not lethal. The responsibility, the duty of his parents to provide the perfect baby would have removed from our society one of the geniuses, one of the founders of modern biology. Ladies and gentlemen, there's definitely something wrong with designer babies. Thank you.
We're now coming to the time where we can make choices about what sorts of genes we have. Now, if you're sceptical about the potential power of genetics, just walk down the park and look at the 300 different breeds of dogs. Some are vicious, some are placid, some are hard-working, some are lazy, some are friendly, some are unfriendly. This is all genetic, the result of a 10,000-year program of genetic selection. Science is enabling us to choose the genes of our children that determine characteristics that fundamentally influence how their lives go. If you've got poor self-control, poor ability to delay gratification, you face the prospect of being at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale and also in jail. You need an IQ of 90 to complete a tax return. I'm not saying that IQ is genetically determined, but if we can influence that IQ, not just through a good education program, as my first speaker said, but also through genetic choices, we should make those choices. Here are some genes that affect behaviours. The COMT gene affects how altruistic you are. The monoamine oxidase A gene determines how aggressive and violent you'll be if you've been abused as a child. The AVPR1A gene determines, in part, or contributes to whether you'll be unfaithful or not. Callous unemotional traits in children, the tendency towards psychopathy has a strong genetic contribution. But isn't this eugenics? Isn't this what the Nazis did, trying to weed out the intellectually disabled, those with psychiatric illness and poor? Well, yes, it is eugenics. Eugenics means well-born. It means trying to have children with better genes. But that's just what we do when we offer people testing for cystic fibrosis, testing for Down syndrome. The reason this isn't Nazi eugenics is because we give people the choice. We think freedom is an important value. In fact, the current regime falls prey to C.S. Lewis' worry about the do-gooder imposing choices on people for their own good, because people aren't allowed to access information that's available and make choices on the basis of it. They're told you must have your child by a lottery rather than being free to choose what kind of child you think is best. Together with a robust sense of what is right and wrong and what's good and bad, and where the Nazis and other totalitarians made moral mistakes, a commitment to non-relative values, then we can ensure that the next generation has even better lives than we have. Thank you.
Leslie Chenoweth.
Thank you. So, my arguments against this proposition focus on several aspects. First, and again, this is projecting to the future. I acknowledge that we don't have the capacity is yet to determine those kinds of physical characteristics that we've been discussing already. But first, the idea, will design go mad? When we leaf through the popular press, it's easy to see that the baby industry is really big business. The triple-O garments with designer labels, the prams that deftly allow the parent who is a runner to get a coffee and keep running. But I can attest from personal experience, these are totally unfathomable for grandparents trying to get them into the back of a car. We have endless programs of musical ability, literacy in the first 12 months, nursery decor that makes Kevin's grand designs look positively amateurish. Design has permeated pregnancy, babies, and all that that entails. So is there anything wrong with that? Well, not really. We live in a time and a nation that values, even enshrines, free choice. Celebrities have made pregnancy and babies very popular again. Indeed, some argue that children have become another accessory, even a commodity for the rich and famous. Will this become the privilege of the rich, and what will it mean for those who could not afford such genetic enhancement? The wealthy, or those that can afford to design babies, may well be those that determine the genetic makeup of the future. Could this mean less diversity or the elimination of certain traits? We've talked a lot about blonde hair and blue eyes. I think it's interesting that still today we refer to that kind of stereotype as desirable. But we do need to value the diversity of all humans. We also need to consider the status of children who perhaps are born naturally or by accident. Will there be a two-tiered hierarchical system of designer babies on top, effectively the chosen ones? Ladies and gentlemen, designer babies are a first world issue. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've discussed two different types of designer babies this evening. The type which are currently feasible with technology that allows us to screen for characteristics such as disease. These are not to be confused with the Frankenstein babies of science fiction, which our opponents have referred to, possible at some undefined point down the track. Because tonight we're talking about making healthy babies, not super babies. While some geneticists are announcing the end of evolution, Quebecian researcher Dennis Riel claims to have shown that human evolution has not come to a halt, but that it doesn't necessarily benefit the species, because evolution only favours those who produce lots of children, not those who are simply excellent people. The people who produce lots of children aren't necessarily the ones we'd choose to buy more of if evolution were a supermarket. Because, you see, evolution isn't interested in what makes a good person, nor does evolution care about our quality of life. We, however, are very interested in our quality of life. Wonderful as children are, we don't want them to be able to, we want them to be able to do more with their lives than just reproduce. Most of the arguments against designer babies boil down to, well, society sucks, and giving people a say over what children they have will perpetuate its suckiness. The arguments the opposition has made fall into the following categories. Firstly, designer babies will cause social inequality. It's true. If people select for the best health and most beneficial characteristics possible, designer babies as a population will have a lower incidence of disease and a greater chance of becoming productive members of society. It essentially elevates mediocrity into a social virtue. Rather than striving for the best, this view says that no one should excel, for fear of creating inequality. We're after well babies. This is not about designing perfect babies. This is about designing babies who aren't sick. And that is why there is nothing wrong with designer babies.
You're finished with Rob Sparrow. Asking people about new technologies is a bit like asking fish about water. Because technology is all around us, we struggle to find a place on which we might stand to think about technology and the role it plays in our lives. We find it especially hard to imagine rejecting a new technology. So the first lesson I've learnt when thinking about technology is that it's a mistake, a profound mistake, to think about new technologies as just offering choices, as though individuals will be able to simply take them or leave them. The choices that we face are in part a product of the options and decisions of those around us. We see this all the time. Think of email and mobile phones. These are technologies with many advantages. But it's completely naive to think that most people have a choice about whether to use them or not, except in the most formal sense. You simply can't have an academic career today without responding to email. So if we're thinking about designer babies, we should not ask, would I like it if I could have a perfect baby? But rather, what would the world be like in which people had the choice to design their children? When we ask that question, we can see that rather than having the choice to use this technology, we will effectively be compelled to, either by the demands of competition for scarce social goods or by a government stepping in to defend the genetic rights of our children. So one thing wrong with designer baby technology then is that it will subject our children's genes to the logic of the marketplace or the healthcare bureaucracy. But the second lesson I've learned in thinking about technology is that it is a mistake to think about it solely in terms of risks and benefits. And of course, this is the language that's easiest for use, a language of accountancy. You think on the one hand, on the other hand, there's some good things, there's some bad things. See if we can put a dollar figure on it. But thinking in that way excludes lots of important questions. We also need to think about meaning. What would it mean to be a parent or a child in a world in which children had designers? What would parental love look like? What would it mean to be human? These are, of course, classically philosophical questions. In future years, perhaps we will be able to say to each other, I see your parents preferred the Apple-seeing gene pack. Or if we are unlucky, when we grow up, someone might observe, I see you got stuck with Microsoft Vista genes. Once humans are made by other humans in this matter of technical manipulation, the line between people and objects will be forever blurred. Thank you.
We've heard from our speakers and a fascinating range of perspectives ranging from the consequential effects of the changes we make through to the meaning of each role we play as human people. Now, it's a chance for you, if you would like, to contribute to this debate. Microphone one.
Look, very quickly, you talked about, on the Ralph Ainsman, you talked about, how it's a first world issue, and of course it's very valid to say people need cleaner water and so on. But the thing is, we're sitting in middle class Australia, so it is about first world. But the point is, imagine if we had budgets that allowed for people to not have diseases. That's a massive amount of money. So you really have to come from that perspective that says, you know what, if you could prevent a disease, that's going to save you a lot of money that you can put to clean water, and that it may not be a first world problem. The point is, it's absolutely about designing, if you want to call it designing, as you say, but about eliminating certain diseases. Like already in America, you actually have to have a test, I believe, if you're a couple, to see if you carry cystic fibrosis. So in some sense, that's already a designer kind of decision.
Microphone one.
The panel has today talked about the therapeutic nature of PGD and the freedom of choice that it gives parents. There was a case in the US where deaf parents wanted to make their child deaf so that the kid would be similar to them. Do you think that the freedom of choice extends to these kind of situations?
Well, that brings the floor debate to an end. Thank you very much to all who have spoken out. Right. Well, before the debate, here was how things stood. Undecided was 36.7%, so I did say there was a lot of people who were undecided. For the motion, 19.9%, and against the motion, 43.4%. Well, the undecided reduced by down to 10%, and it's really close. Winning the motion with 47% was the for side, and against 43%. So I declare the motion won. That is one of the most remarkable swings we've had in these debates ever. Fantastic to the speakers. I congratulate everybody. And ladies and gentlemen, for 2012, this is the final Intelligence Squared debate. Thank you for your participation in this House, and I now declare the debate closed.
Even if humans knew where the gene for blue eyes was, which by the way we don't, we could hardly help to create a couple, to give a couple a blue-eyed baby if both of them were very dark-skinned and of African heritage, because simply the embryos wouldn't have the gene in the first place. And quite frankly, it would be rather flippant to try. Given the interventions required to test a small finite of embryos, I actually doubt whether really anybody would actually be bothered trying.